You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
All right. Well, yeah, here we go. Another episode of the Shockwave Skull Session podcast. Episode number 46, co-host, producer Matt Hartman. Of course, I'm joined by the Armenian maven of metal and founder of the podcast himself, Mr. Bob Nalbandian, who's, feeling a little under the weather today. I know you couldn't make it to the studio, Bob, but he's checking in at home via Skype. And, what's going on, Bob?
Doing good. Looking forward to this episode. You put a really good one together here, Matt.
Yeah, I'm really pumped for this one. We got two special guests here for this episode, both coming to us from the Big Apple in New York. And first up, we've got well-renowned riffmeister from the legendary New York hardcore thrash crossover band Leeway, who put his talents on display on two of the all-time greatest New York hardcore classic records, Born to Expire and Desperate Measures, and he currently plays with his band Black Ice. I'm talking about the mighty Michael Gibbons. What's up, Mike? How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me, everybody.
Yeah,
Hello,
of course.
Everybody.
Right on.
You're very generous with your adjectives.
It's true, man. No bullshit in there. It's all true. And of course, guest number 2 is a return guest to the podcast, and he's basically a jack of all trades within the music business, and most known from as the founder of the infamous In-Effect Records out of Hollis, Queens in New York in the late 80s and early 90s, who went on to release hardcore metal classics from bands like Prong and Nuclear Assault, Agnostic Front, Sick of It All, just to name a few. And he's also he was an A&R rep at Roadrunner Records throughout the 90s, which, I mean, we could do a whole podcast on his involvement with just those bands he worked with there for sure. But nowadays, he's a book author. He put out the Merciless Book of Metalists, as well as the ABCs of Metallica, which was just released in late 2019. And, of course, we're talking about Howie Abrams. And speaking of books and Sick of It All, Howie, I recently just saw the cover for your latest book called The Blood and the Sweat, the story of Sick of It All's Kohler brothers. That's coming out this summer. And I personally can't wait to read this book, man. I'm so glad finally someone, put out a book on those guys and their history. I know you've obviously known those guys for years, going back to working with them at In-Effect when you released their iconic debut full-length Blood, Sweat, No Tears. And, the band is very well known for being if not one of the hardest-working bands on the globe. Just a machine, I mean, for 30 plus years now. So it must be cool for you to kind of come full circle, sort of, and be able to work with those guys again on this book, huh?
It's pretty cool because, honestly, I mean, I knew them before I ever worked with them at the label,
Oh, okay.
So we're going back even further. They kicked off the band in 1986, and I knew those guys a little bit through mutual friends before that. So to have now fast forward all these years and worked with them on their book is an amazing honor, but it was an amazing experience. And, it was really just a lot of fun because all we did is just bullshit about their history, a lot of which I actually knew, but we got to go into a lot of detail about things that I think, the people who've been fans of the band all these years really would love to know about.
You guys both, I mean, obviously in the New York hardcore scene in the 80s. And speaking of In Effect, I mean, I did read that you guys actually tried to buy out the Leeway contract from that whole fiasco with Profile Records. Is that correct, Howie?
We sure did. And Mike and I have had some exchanges about this in the past too, because since I started doing books, I've actually been interviewed, and it's I've talked about this because I always get were there bands that got away, that you really wanted to sign to In Effect or Roadrunner? And, the first band I always mention is Leeway because I loved Leeway. I was like a fucking Leeway super fan. Mm-hmm. I reviewed the Enforcer demo, for my fanzine, in 1985. And I'd already seen the band a few times and I was just a fan, Mm-hmm. And then, they went up and did Born to Expire up at Normandy Sound, and people were just floored by that album, and everybody kind of in New York got to hear it before it came out because it sat there for so long. And I remember, Mike, you probably remember this, the van, that's the photo that you guys used where you're sitting in the back of the van, you guys would sit in that van in front of CB's and play the album for everybody.
That was Zowie's van.
Oh, it's Zowie's van.
That was Zowie's van. That picture was taken on the 15th of November, 1987.
Right. And when did the album actually come out?
January 21st, 1989.
Wow.
Right. So it just sat there for freaking ever. And like, again, I'd heard the album and I loved it. And, you know, the production, the material, half of it I probably had heard live already. But then the rest of it was great as well. And so, you know, we started talking about trying to hit up Profile and see if we can get the album from them and put it out. Because we were kind of on a roll with An-Effect at this point, you know, with Sick of It All and Killing Time and 24/7 Spies was out now and Madball. So, and AF and, you know, so we were like, let's try to get this album. And then what happened was we probably could have gotten it from the label, but then I guess it must have been Chris Williamson that said, well, what about an advance for the band? And we're like, we're fucking In-Effect Records. Like, well, how much money do you think we have? Like, we're going to be spending all the money to get the record. You know, we don't have money to then give to the band as well. So that's where that fell apart. And from what I found out later, like Mike and probably Pokey, whoever else at the time, whoever was in the band at that moment, other than maybe Eddie and AJ, had no idea that this discussion was even happening or that all happened.
Interesting. Wow. Okay.
Now, how wasn't In-Effect that went through Relativity, right? Or I guess Important Records at the time, right?
Yeah. So Important was like the overall parent company, and we were the third in-house label. So you had Relativity, Combat, and then In-Effect.
Right.
Okay.
But yeah, we wanted that album badly.
Well, everything Howie says is dead spot on. I mean, honestly, Howie, we sort of did know what was going on because remember Pokey used to work with you guys as a day job at Important Records.
Yep.
And Pokey was always telling me, look, Chris Williamson's asking way too much crazy money for us. Like he thinks we're Kiss or Led Zeppelin.
Wow.
Right.
This isn't happening. He wanted the money to pocket for himself. The band wasn't going to see it done. This guy was a common thief.
Yeah.
And that's what it came down to. That's why, In-Effect was a brand new label just starting out and doing an amazing job for the bands that were on the label, like Killing Time and AF and Sick of It All. I mean, they were doing, you know, they were doing an excellent job for these guys. And bottom line is, Chris Williamson wanted too much money for Leeway, and he just wanted the pocket money. The guy was a greedy guy. That's why he fell apart.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about like the numbers of a time like that, right? Picture 1988, 89. Like $40,000-$50,000 for a band was out of the question. You know what I mean? Like that was not something anybody could do. And so we got ourselves to a point where we were like, we could probably pay the $20,000 it'll take to get them off a Profile and get the record and whatever the contract was for however many records it was. But that was it. That's where it had to end. And, you know, so when we were asked for more money, we're like, you're crazy. Like this, I don't know what you think this is. Like we're saving your ass. Like that's what we want to do. And we want to do it because we think the band's great and the record's great. But like, you know, you got to take a little hit here for the fact that all this got fucked up and you got that deal.
Did Profile go out of business by this time or like 1990?
No, they were still very much in business because
they were more hip hop, right? Did they, I mean, the Rock Hotel kind of more hardcore thing, were they still involved in that or?
That, I think that fell apart, right, Mike? Like that.
Yeah, it did.
Ended.
That was gone by like 1990, Rock Hotel Records. That was Chris's label through Profile Distribution, Landmark. That was their distribution.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what Leeway went through, right? Rock Hotel?
Yes.
Rock Hotel, right.
Right.
And the same thing, it was the Cro-Mags, Murphy's Law, Leeway, I think Wargasm, right?
Wargasm, yeah, them too.
And then I think that was it for that. But then later they started another label through Profile called Another Planet.
Yeah.
And they did mostly like the reissues. Like, so they did these really great deluxe reissues of like the first two Leeway albums, right? The two first, the couple of Cro-Mags albums.
You did the Mob too, right?
The Mob,
Murphy's Law.
And you know, so they did and they were really great reissues, but they weren't really signing bands.
Okay.
But Profile's head was definitely in the like hip hop and dance world. I mean, it's the label most notably is for Run DMC, like they were Run DMC's label. And, you know, it's like those things where early on in the label, like Run DMC got so big after a while, they probably almost bankrupted the label, you know, because they needed money to, you know, to press records, you know, and they didn't have it. But they had all these big dance singles and a couple of really big like urban hits, and Chris went in there, but they didn't really have like any kind of marketing or promotion going on. They relied on word of mouth, which hardcore had, but hardcore moves more now. It moves more fast than it ever did. Okay. But at that time, when everybody heard that Leeway record, and so for it to sit for well over a year and not be released, I mean, there were cassettes of it everywhere,
Hell yeah.
And kids just wanted it, so they got it. And people, still like the era of tape trading and all that stuff. And it was very easy to get Born to Expire without ever buying it.
That's interesting you say that, because, me, as you know, Howie and Matt, I grew up in L.A. During that scene, and I had my fanzine Headbanger till about 85, 86, I think it stopped. So it was just before that, but I remember hearing about Leeway because, I mean, I think if I'm not wrong, Michael, didn't the band form like in 84 or something, even prior to you?
Well, the band was formed in 1984, and they were originally called The Unruled by Eddie and AJ.
That's right.
Okay, because I remember from the punks, I hung around a lot of punks, and they originally talked about Leeway. I don't know if Leeway did some crossover shows at the Olympic Auditorium or what, but a lot of
they had never been out there yet, Bob. Like,
right.
I remember I saw Leeway as a 4-piece. When only demos were out, like the Enforcer demo had just come out, probably, or was about to come out, and Mike wasn't in the band yet. And so they had this metal edge to them, even though they had played in 84. They were playing with bands like Kraut and all the other Queens, hardcore bands and stuff, and punk bands. But AJ always had this metallic edge to his playing. And so what was cool is they were kind of crossover, like they're similar to Sick of It All this way to me, in that they were crossover without being crossover at the time. They just did their thing, and they had an appeal to both, and I think later they I feel like you, Mike, you would know more, like when you joined the band, but I felt like when they brought you in, it was like a full embrace of them being a full real deal crossover band,
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I'll be honest with you, everybody. I bought the Enforcer demo from the original drummer in high school. I went to high school with him.
Right.
I mean, I went to high school with Sid and Arthur from Gorilla Biscuits. Ernie was in my high school, but Ernie from Token Entry, but he was a few years ahead of me. Right? Davey Gunner was a little older than me from Crowd, but they all went to my high school. And I remember saying to Sasso, the original Leeway drummer, if you ever need a guitarist, man, let me know. And he exited the band like a year after that because he wanted to play football and the whole thing. But I would actually go to Leeway shows before I was in the band. When I found out they needed a guitarist, man, I said, well, how do I audition?
Yeah, because I mean, Leeway was really fucking good before Mike Gibbons, and they were fucking awesome with Mike Gibbons. That's not a blow smoke up your ass thing. That's real deal. I mean, it just completed the band. It completed the sound, the look on stage, the whole thing. Like I feel like that's when they became a force as opposed to just being a band. Mm-hmm. Of all the bands in New York, I just thought they were going to be fucking huge, Sure. And what's interesting is you talked about Sick of It All before, I interviewed Gary Holt for the book because of that first tour. So we were talking about it, and the one thing he said when they took him on tour is he goes, we weren't really aware of what exactly was going on the East Coast, especially in New York. He goes, we heard a little bit about it, but we didn't really know yet. And he goes, I knew about this band Leeway, right? And then he starts talking about how he found out about Leeway. And then there were shows together later on. But, he was talking about that's the band that he heard of, and it's because the metal kids really did embrace them, mm-hmm. And, it was early enough in the New York scene where, COC and DRI, and what a terrible week for those two fucking bands,
I know,
right?
Unfortunately.
So it's but COC and DRI were the two co-blueprints for the crossover, mm-hmm. As far as the hardcore scene was concerned. And then you had bands in New York like Leeway, and then there was also NYC Mayhem, which is Craig Satari's band, who is in Sick of It All. And they were like, I guess Mayhem was kind of like New York's DRI,
Okay.
And I feel like Leeway was New York's Bay Area band.
Well, yeah, I mean, they were really, I mean, if you listen to both those records, I mean, obviously, and that's why it connected, I think, a lot to the metal fans, was the sounds of those records were very more metallic than I would say, obviously all the other classic, New York hardcore bands like Cro-Mags, where, I mean, even though Cro-Mags did have some metal to them on like Age of Quarrel and so forth, I mean, Leeway was really, when I first heard them, it was like, to me, it was a thrash band. With some hardcore thrown into the mix, which is why I think they really crossed over well with the metal scene. I mean, even like, to this day, I don't know if you guys have heard the band Power Trip, a great, great band.
Oh yeah, I love Power Trip.
Yeah, I mean, the lead vocalist Riley Gale, he basically came out and said, the first big record that was a huge influence on that band in the early days was Desperate Measures. I mean, they love Born Expired as well, but they're huge fans of Leeway. They even played, I guess they actually covered the intro to Kingpin on a lot of their early shows and stuff I read, which is really cool. And I think, Mike, you coming in a band, did you bring more of the metal sound to Leeway than was there beforehand?
Yeah, without a doubt.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that was like sort of when I came in the band, I definitely brought more of a metal attack on the guitar and more of a metal edge.
Okay.
And you also played leads.
Well, I mean, there was really no lead guitar and Leeway at the time and everything. And I remember when we recorded Born to Expire, I just went out there to do the rhythm tracks. And Chris Olmstead, the producer at the time, he turned everything around at the original recording. He said, "No, you're playing the solos." I said, "I have nothing written. I have nothing prepared." He said, "Just go in there and go nuts." So every solo you hear on Born to Expire is just thin air made up right there.
Wow, that's awesome.
As it should be. As it should be.
Yeah, straight off the, that's why there's a lot of Kirk Hammett things going on in there.
Right. No, but the
I was like, let me go to my Kirk Hammett. My old people Kirk Hammett riffing.
It's funny, again, growing up on the West Coast and, what Howie was saying about, when he spoke with Gary Holt, it was very different because the New York scene, especially the hardcore scene then, wasn't very well known here on the West Coast. And we got it. Is that your dog?
Yes.
Cool. When SOD kind of broke out, that kind of got, and of course the, Pro Mags. And that was like when I was still doing the fanzines. So I was aware of this, I was getting some of the albums and this and that. But, as you say, there was such, a month or two could mean a worlds of difference back then as far as release, let alone a year or two. And I remember, obviously you joined in like 86 and seeing the album coming out, in 89. A lot has transpired, but before that. And I think I remember the Crumbsuckers. I remember a lot of those bands, of course, Bad Brains, but they weren't like real big. But I remember there was a big buzz on that. And it seemed to, like in the 90s, more kind of explode when you had, Prong and even bands like, not necessarily hardcore, but, White Zombie came to fold and Helmet. And then it was like this huge buzz about that New York scene. But it really started in the mid 80s with you guys. And like Howie said, that scene really should have kind of been huge. And to the metal fans, I think SOD, obviously with the Anthrax connection, kind of connected that with the metal fans. And then, we were familiar with the CBGB, and Agnostic Front and all these different bands that were, the crossover stuff, but it never really transpired as much here on the West Coast. We had, Suicidal and, the other Venice bands, No Mercy and whatever else.
XL.
But it was kind of a different thing, but it's interesting, going back and, especially hearing you guys talk about this and the influence it had on a lot of the metal bands.
What's interesting that I thought and that I remember is that the crossover in New York really originally happened at like CB's and stuff. It did not happen at L'Amour. L'Amour was L'Amour was afterward. And that was like the metal club and CB's was the punk hardcore club. Right. And so, metal kids coming to see bands like COC and like 84, 85, DRI, that was the crossover, and the metal thing, it was sort of easy for punks to go to metal clubs as opposed to metal kids going to the hardcore clubs because the hardcore thing here was very, very tight knit. It was very small. And so when you showed up, everybody noticed you, whereas like Lemoore was this giant rock club, where the shows tended to be bigger. So there was like the cultural part of all that stuff too. And so you saw the difference happening at CB's really quickly and the music changing. And Leeway was one of the bands that was really a part of that. Crumbsuckers, absolutely. But it took a lot of those bands years to get records out, and it wasn't until their records came out that the rest of the country, let alone the rest of the world, got to catch on. And so I feel like maybe the Bay Area and LA had like a better tape trading circuit for metal, although there were certainly metal tape traders here. But like, for instance, when I would trade tapes with Ron Quintana, like back then, he wanted like soundboards from CBGBs, whereas I wanted, like, you got the Exodus rehearsals, like that kind of stuff. And he wanted the Agnostic Front show from the previous Sunday from the soundboard, And so we were all part of that crossover. But here it was like taking place at a different place and like with different bands and, with different kids. Whereas, our equivalent, Lemoore, was not really where it happened until a couple of years after CB's.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's funny. You brought up too about, because one thing, I mean, growing up in New York, and I'm sure you guys could attest to this as well, back in the 80s, especially in Manhattan, it's not, there was never really, like, to me, at least when I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, there wasn't like a huge metal scene. Most of the metal bands had to kind of almost go through the hardcore scene in a way, because sometimes, I don't know if it's mainly Manhattan, but I know, like, if you really wanted to see like good metal or something, New Jersey, upstate, Long Island, usually it's where a lot of the metal came from. Where to me in the cities, the city and the boroughs, it was like you didn't really have like really big scenes that pertain to metal bands. Where, like I said, a lot of metal bands had to almost kind of come up through the hardcore scenes to kind of make their name or to just to play shows and so forth. Did you guys see that too as well in the 80s? I know it was a lot different. I know, how you were just talking about, how it was really the metal kids that would go to those punk rock shows, where rather than the opposite, where the punk rockers would come to the metal shows.
Yeah, that happened a little later. Like, I think, the only thing I'll say is like there's always been a great metal scene in New York, but like you said, the outer boroughs, like it certainly wasn't in Manhattan. Look at Lemoore survived and existed because it could be in Brooklyn. It was in a warehouse district where you could fucking stab 10 people outside and it didn't matter. Like, you wouldn't even get caught. It's like it was in the middle of a wasteland. So and so was CBGB's when it started doing hardcore shows. It was it was all homeless people basically, and was for a lot of its existence. But you had like the Man-O-Wars and the Twisted Sisters, right? Like in the early 80s. But then all the bands from out of town would play there in the very, very early 80s. Motorhead, everybody would come through and play there. But then, you had your Anthraxes and your Nuclear Assaults and your Overkills, right? And they thrived out there. But, really, it was like a band like Nuclear Assault to me was the first, metal band that really played both, right? Where they legitimately play both. They would play a Lemoore show on a Friday, and 3 weeks later they played a Sunday hardcore matinee. Yeah. And at least with them, what was cool is nobody said, "What's this metal band doing here?" They were like, "Oh, that's John and Danny's band," because they knew them from being there. So it wasn't this foreign, thing. Whereas other people would come down there and they'd never go to shows there. And their band would show up and they'd have this big metal presentation and like, "How the fuck you doing?" And like kids at the matinees didn't want to hear that shit. They didn't want to be yelled at. Only during the songs can you yell at them. You can't yell at them between songs. And, so it was always like a funny thing. Like I remember that band Blessed Death from New Jersey. They played a show once with Agnostic Front. It was like a weird Thursday night show. It wasn't a matinee. And I think they came in with this like preconceived notion of like what the punk and hardcore kids wanted, you know? And they did this song called Into the Ovens. And, you know, you can only imagine what it was about, you know, and I don't think it wasn't like pro-Nazi, but it was just very, you know, like, you know, they were pushing the envelope with the lyrics. And so, you know, and you had bands like Agnostic Front who had to live down this horrible reputation, like around the country and like all this stuff, and people thinking that they were this fascist band and whatever. And like, so here they come with like Into the Ovens, and the kids who were there to see Agnostic Front, which is pretty much all of them, basically made it so that Blessed Death couldn't finish their set and never played there again.
Wow.
You know, because they were just like, you don't get it, and we're not having that here. You know,
you know, that's interesting. You know what you say about the punk and the metal, the way it crossed over in New York with the hardcore scene. It was so different in L.A. and you know, even in San Francisco after doing putting together this Bay Area documentary, which is going to be coming out soon. Bay Area Godfathers. You know, talking to a lot of the people, the clubs in San Francisco even were a lot more open-minded to thrash. Of course, in L.A., they weren't so open-minded. I grew up in Orange County, which was kind of the punk capital, and it was, you know, the Cuckoo's Nest when I was younger, where all the punk bands would play, and metal fans wouldn't dare go there. I mean, I worked out at Carl's Jr., you know, when I was 16, 17. We're talking 80 or so, and a lot of my punks were going, you know, we were going to clubs at that age, 16, 17, whatever.
Yeah.
They would try to drag me to the Cuckoo's Nest. I'm like, fuck no, man, I ain't going out there. I was always a metal guy. But I would take them to see, you know, Metallica or Slayer at the Woodstock when they were, you know, still like cover bands and whatnot. But, you know, I eventually went to the punk shows at places like Metal Arc. I would see the Vandals and the Dickies, which by then it was a little bit more open. But, you know, it was this real, like, if you're a punk, you know, it's separated from metal. But the punks would come to when Motorhead played, that was the first time I really saw crossover. And I think 83 was it when they did when Brian Robertson first joined the band with it was Motorhead and Crocus. And it was like a metal show, but all the punks came, and that was the first time we saw all these punks, and everyone's thinking, "Oh shit, a riot's going to break out. This is going to be crazy."
Well, you would see a little bit of it at Motorhead here, but it was really Venom, I think, that brought everything together.
That was what I was going to mention. The Venom Slayer show was what really brought it. The Ultimate Revenge, Venom Slayer.
Revenge show,
yeah. I remember even 2 years before that when Venom headlined here, those 2 nights on Staten Island in 1983 with Metallica opening. And let's be honest, there were about 7 people who knew who Metallica was. Wow. But you know, basically when Venom played, I mean, that was the first show I remember where, you know, I considered it basically a metal show, and you saw, you know, like giant Liberty Spikes and fucking Mohawks and skinheads, you know, at the show. Of their own free will, you know, and that they were legitimately fans. And, you know, it comes, you know, like Discharge were Venom fans and things like that. And, you know, sometimes it comes from people seeing each other's T-shirts. But, you know, I was going to ask Mike, like, because you guys played CB's Matinees, you played the Ritz, you played L'Amour. I mean, did you see like a big difference in like the types of crowds in New York that you would play to around that period, like when Born to Expire was out?
Yeah, I did. There was definitely a different fan base that showed up at a CB show than at a L'Amour show. I mean, everything Howie was talking about before is true. You know, it was sort of segregated. You know, you would expect certain people that follow certain genres at certain places. And, you know, the outer boroughs held on to the metal standard pretty strongly. Yeah. Manhattan didn't really have anything, you know, unless a big metal show came to town, like the Ultimate Revenge tour at the Ritz. Or, you know, something like that.
And that would be the only metal show of the year, you know, in Manhattan.
Yeah.
You know, Brooklyn would have it every week, maybe twice a week. But in Manhattan, there'd be nothing, right?
Right. Manhattan, you know, there was the Ritz, you know, Slayer, the internationals would come to town. Slayer would come to town, or, you know, Motorhead.
Right.
But you know, CB's every Sunday there was something happening.
Well, you know, it's very similar to L.A. How you know, Hollywood and the Sunset Strip, as everyone think, oh, that was the metal capital. That was all glam. You didn't have the real, the metal and the thrash and all that. That was all happening in East LA, maybe some in Pasadena, or at least the heavier stuff. And Orange County, the clubs there were, they would book, that's where, the Metallicas and the Slayers and Dark Angel and all these bands started out. But it was so hard for them to go to Hollywood. And I think it's kind of similar, like you say, with Manhattan in New York, and you had your suburbs, and you had obviously CBGBs, you had the places in Brooklyn and L'Amour's that, would book that kind of stuff. But here in LA, man, it was, and it really bugs me that everyone thinks that LA was all glam. When you went to like downtown LA, Olympic Auditorium, Vendors Ballroom, and Long Beach and all these other places, that's where the real crossover started, where you would have Suicidal and DRI play with the Slayers and, the other punk and metal bands. That's when it really crossed over. That was right after Metallica left to the Bay Area. And
Right.
That's when, metal kind of, they realized that the thrash scene, we didn't have an independent thrash scene, so all the heavier bands, they couldn't play the Hollywood clubs. They had to play the bigger places with the punk bands,
Right.
COC and all that. And that's where you had all those big crossover shows at the Olympic Auditorium, like I said, Fenders, all that kind of stuff. And that really was what started that. But still, LA was always known as the glam thing because of Hollywood. But there was so much more.
Well, with Hollywood, I know it's a little bit different in New York, because in New York, right, it was really punk and hardcore centric, where it's sort of the opposite in Hollywood. Where Suicidal, they couldn't play in Hollywood for years.
Oh, they got banned.
They got banned, yeah. So it was sort of opposite, where it was fine for metal, but when they heard the word hardcore, even when I was doing my label, and we had our, the band Count Time play in there, we could, once they heard the word hardcore, the Whiskey, these places, they wanted nothing to do with it. Nothing. If they had that name connected to it, where in New York City was was actually the opposite, where it was more if you have metal connected to you, they really didn't want much to do with you. It was more they were totally fine with the punk and hardcore.
Well, it's funny that you say that, and going back to what Bob said too, like you referred to it, for instance, as the thrash scene, right? And like out here, I don't think anybody ever really referred to it as the thrash scene. You went to hardcore shows or you went to metal shows. And even when there were crossover shows, you probably picked one of the names, you know what I mean? Like it was, you were sort of one or the other. And I remember when right in the really early days of the crossover, a lot of metal kids who had gotten into hardcore a little bit earlier, like can cut their hair and all that kind of stuff. And they just tried to like disassociate themselves from metal, and it was really stupid because, at the end of the day, it was really just music, but the culture and the attitude out here for sure was kind of everything. And the reason that the crossover worked is because most kids who would show up at the CB's matinees who were maybe metal kids that were going to a hardcore show, if you were cool and were just there for the music and whatever, and you weren't trying to, it wasn't all about you, everything was fine, And but if it was all about the dance floor and being a jerk, like out on the dance floor, you were going to get pummeled, And that's what happened, because it's like going into someone else's house and like, no, this is how we're going to do things, It's like, no, actually, it's not, because we've been here for years, And so it was an interesting time, but it was about the music, but it like in terms of like you saying thrash, like so there was a like a common thread of the speed, right? So that was a big part of it here too, the speed. But New York had its own style too. I mean, that's where the whole mosh thing comes from, like that's so overused and, got played out, which is that was a real thing. And the whole mosh thing out here was about sort of like a slower tribal tempo thing, whereas like out in LA and San Francisco, it was about fast and circle pits, And so that was a big part of it too. Like people would come out here and be like, how come people go nuts like when we play the slower or mid-tempo stuff? And it's like, because that's closer to the New York style, right?
Oh, cool.
So like the breakdowns, like Leeway had these breakdowns in the songs, these groove breakdowns that were like, that's what made them that's what related them so much to the hardcore scene too, was those breakdowns, because that's what would drive the CB's crowd nuts. But then you'd play L'Amour and kids were like, they wanted the fast shit and they wanted to do circle pits like with the metal bands, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was different out here too. And so, you know, now you have this whole fucking ridiculous karate thing that goes on, and it's gotten completely out of control.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah,
like,
crowd
you know,
killing.
Yeah.
it's just stupid, you know?
Mm.
And, you know, you have metal people like who was like, I wish these hardcore kids wouldn't do this shit at our shows. And it's like, well, it's too late for that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But it used to be different, you know? It used to be two different things.
Mm-hmm.
And so kids would react to a band differently at Lemoore than they did at CB's.
Yeah, it was very territorial. As somebody that went to CB's, I frequented CB's every Sunday, say from December of '85, the first day I ever walked into the place, all the way to the actual, if you remember, Howie, the actual last show with Both Worlds back in like '91.
Yeah.
Or I would be there. Me and Pokey actually would be there every Sunday.
Me too.
And one thing I never did, even being in Leeway or whatever, you know, I had long hair. I never, ever went near that circle, ever.
You had a target
So
on you, huh? Just because your hair?
It was unforgiving.
Yeah.
So what? You're in fucking Leeway and you got, you know, this is our circle. It ain't yours. You go to Lemoore, you know? Not that anybody ever was disrespectful and said something like that to me or anything, but I just knew enough. This is a very territorial pit, and it's a sacred place.
Mm-hmm.
And there were always New Jacks, you know, so
Mm-hmm.
there were always people there who were new themselves and they were trying to prove something.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd go after the long-haired guy. And then, you know, like even the old timers would beat the shit out of them, you know, because they were just like,
yeah.
They're like, no, you're not here. You're not hunting metal kids here. Like, that's not what's going on. But then every week there'd be some new jerk off who would do something like that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
That's
And
how
so-
it was Cuckoo's Nest.
Right. So it was just, you know, I hear, you know, nightmares about the Olympic Auditorium, right? So it's like,
Oh, there were some. I mean, the problem with LA, I don't know if it was New York, but the thing with LA, when all that crossover started, and you know, you had the gang affiliation.
well,
The
there's
punk
that.
gang,
Yeah.
you had the Suicidals, you had the
Right.
you had
Circle
Circle One. You had all these people, and they were fucking violent, and it was scary. I mean, going to Fender's Ballroom or the Olympic. I know you've heard some stories about the Olympic Auditorium. I mean, there were stabbings. There was. I mean, it got real violent, and that's what killed it. And even, you know, some of the big places like the Olympic, there was a time where, you know, they weren't even, you know, they couldn't afford the insurance to have this stuff. Bands had to go to Tijuana, Mexico to play. You know,
Right.
Right.
you know, so it was. I think that's what really killed. You know, that scene, at least in LA. I don't know. Was it similar in New York, or was there?
No, it was absolutely the opposite, because the other thing I was going to say about New York, LA, is that it's so spread out, right?
Yes.
So you have all these counties like everywhere, and
Yeah.
people would
Huge.
drive,
It's huge.
you know, an hour and a half to go to the shows. So like you were still, even if you were an hour and a half away, Mike, right? In like Long Island or something like that, or part of Jersey, it still felt kind of close,
Mhm.
right?
Oh, yeah, without a doubt.
So, and the five boroughs were just one and the same ultimately, right? So you didn't have kids from the Bronx beefing with kids from Brooklyn at Lemoore shows. That didn't happen, you know? It wasn't like that. So it's not so spread out here. You know, you also have a mass transit system that connects everybody, and it's a really different thing where I feel like out there, if you came from Orange County into Hollywood, or even, you know, like a certain town in Orange County, you know, like you were at odds already with the other people that weren't from where you were from, you know?
You definitely had that, yeah.
And then you had the gang thing too, right? So it's like being in prison, like whose side are you on, you know?
Well, the problem too is most of the clubs. I mean, you know, like Mike Muir was doing stuff, you know, basically in Watts, you know, and down, you know, the worst of the worst areas, because those were the only places they'd be allowed to play, you know. So that made it a lot worse, you know. So it was a whole different thing, you know.
Yeah, New York was never like that, because and always the bigger shows were always more of a, you know, a problem than the smaller shows. Like, so CB's, like, for all the like stuff we talk about, like if you saw a fight at CB's, it would be between like two people who knew each other usually, and they would just actually have a fight. And, you know, so there was that. And then later on, you would see like fights between like the sort of outsiders who came in to be tough guys, you know, and like they did the wrong thing or like did something to the wrong person, and they just got, you know, regulated basically. like, no, you don't do that here, you know, and you can come back, but don't ever do that again, you know? And so that was different. But then you had the bigger shows, like the rich shows, which would have a bit of a mix of bands and things like that. And, when it's a big dark club, it's easy to hide, right? So it's easy to act like a jerk. And, so people would take advantage of that, and they would be more violent and things like that, because you didn't have to look anybody in the eye, at CB's, you had to look everybody in the eye. I mean, the place didn't hold that many people, and so you'd have your odd show with like an agnostic front where they'd somehow jam like 700 people in there. But, the place legally held 300, and in the early days, I mean, there were never 300 people in there, there would be 75, 100 people in there, and so it was a very different thing. Like coming in there and acting like an asshole was not an easy thing to do, and everyone there knew each other. So you were the ugly American, you were the outsider. And they made sure you knew it, and you could earn your way in, like whether you were in a band or you were just cool to people, or you had a fanzine or whatever, and if you made yourself a part of it, it was great. But there was always the people who thought it was about like the image, and that was more important than the music and all that stuff, and came in with the tough guy thing, and that's what killed it.
Yeah. And Mike, you guys with Leeway, you guys played a lot. Out in Long Island, in a lot of the suburbs and stuff, and that's where you also got a lot of your fan base, correct? I mean, you guys definitely you played Long Island a lot, I believe.
Sundance,
right? Yeah, the old Sundance.
Yeah, Sundance was the place.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and that place was amazing. At Crumbsuckers, I know they played there all the time. I mean, yeah. Tell us a little bit about Sundance, because that's like a place you don't really hear a lot of people talk about a lot, because it's in Long Island. It's not a classic New York hardcore club, but Sundance was definitely a spot that had, I mean, Biohazard, I remember, played out. I mean, a lot of bands were playing out Long Island, and that's also, I think, another reason why the hardcore, stuff really got big, in the late 80s or even into the 90s. I know with, like, eventually VOD came along. I know how you signed them to Roadrunner and stuff, and,
Yeah, I mean, VOD's from Long Island. I always refer to Sundance as, like, the Lemoore of Long Island.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's how I felt. That's how I felt it was. I mean, any national that came to town that speed metal or thrash metal, whatever act, hardcore. If you played Lemoore, you definitely had another. If you played Lemoore Friday night, you're going to be at Sundance Saturday night. If you were Testament to somebody, or it was a nice straight rectangular flat club set up just like Lemoore. A lot of the bands played out there because it was centrally located. It was in Western Suffolk in Bayshore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so it was easily accessible, like that's how we said, because New York's very concentrated, and there's a network of transportation to go anywhere around here. And, Sundance was, Frank Cariola was the promoter. It was a great place to hang and play. And, it was great for bands to try and spread their name and their music on Long Island. You definitely wanted to play Sundance. Of course, there were the earlier clubs, like the Right Track Inn, where Leeway played there before I was even in the band. It was a small
Sickville's first show was there, yeah.
Wow.
Right, everybody's first show was at February's on Hempstead Turnpike.
Yeah, I remember that place. Yeah, February's. Wow, yeah.
First place.
I mean, that was my first show, though. I'll tell you the date, November 6th, 1985. I'll never forget it.
Wow.
I mean,
they would let you in there to drink at 13.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, fake ID, forget it. And that's when you didn't have pictures on your driver's license or anything. You just
That's right.
go to the drugstore and get remember those half ink, half pencil erasers? You can erase the number on your license and turn a 6 into a 3, so you were 3 years older.
Mm-hmm.
But Sundance had a great scene, and bands that hail from Long Island, such as Ludacris and Crumbsuckers and VOD, and made their own scene out here. And then it was. I like Sundance. I like playing there. I like going there.
Yeah, it was. Long Island was great that way, and then so it was, Jersey had a similar thing. So you had,
sure.
Like you had City Gardens in Trenton, and it felt like Northern New Jersey kept rotating clubs. Like there wasn't one place that was really there. But I do remember like Studio One in Newark.
Studio One was great. Yeah.
Yeah, and then they had the Pipeline, which was the smaller place in Newark.
Pipeline.
But like everybody kind of played Studio One in Newark, and then City Gardens too. And listen, it's very, generally speaking, it's very suburban music. It's kind of for everybody, but it always sort of went a little better in Jersey and Long Island, and that's what makes New York so unique, because really in Manhattan, there was actually like a music scene, you know, and the metal scene really was in Brooklyn, you know. So yeah, there were fans all over the place, and there were record stores in Manhattan and stuff, but the scene was in Brooklyn, you know, and
absolutely,
people would play
I mean,
in Brooklyn.
Now, when you say
sorry,
metal, what bands? I mean, I know obviously, you know, Twisted Sister were probably a little bit. They were probably outgrown from the club era. Then was Manowar playing? I mean, even going back to the early '80s, was Manowar and the Rods and Riot? Were they
Manowar, the Rods, all those bands, every one of them. Motorhead would come from out of town. Who was that?
Cities.
Oh yeah, Cities was
sure.
A few minutes later, but like all the sort of, you know, bands you read about in Kerrang, like kind of early on, like from New York, like yes, that was all Lemoore and Lemoore East, because there was
Lemoore East. I was just going to say this.
That's right.
You know, and so Motorhead would play both, and then for instance, even when the Venom Slayer Exodus show at Studio 54, people forget that Slayer and Exodus played the night before at Lemoore East. And, you know, like apparently there were like 300 people there. Like nobody knew it was happening.
Wow.
You know,
because Lemoore, I'm sorry to interrupt, because Howie, if you remember, Lemoore East caught, you know, it started booking more toward hair metal acts.
Big time.
Like, because I lived, at the time, I lived 15 minutes from Lemoore East. I grew up in Middle Village, Queens.
Right.
And I remember I always traveled to Brooklyn where the speed metal and the hardcore stuff was, you know. Because Lemoore East always had, like, you know, Malice playing or Great White or...
Right. Queensryche played there.
I mean, I was there for the Queensryche shows, of course, but, you know...
I think everybody in New York was at that show. It was the most crowded show I've ever seen.
Bro, I remember jumping into the air to get oxygen.
It was insane.
Just jumping up just to get out. It was insanity.
It was probably the most crowded building I've ever been in.
Wow.
Yeah, that was.
I remember, like, I saw Motorhead there. I saw Manowar there.
Motorhead there.
Who else did I see? I saw Carnivore there, but it was like a weird benefit show, like early on in the Carnivore days, like before they had an album out, like when they still wore the fur and shit.
Oh yeah.
And thermonuclear warriors, you know. So I saw them there, and you know, like that was a weird one. You know, and again, like 10 people at the show. They were opening for some bands, and like 10 people knew who Carnivore was, you know. But I was there to see Carnivore, you know.
I mean, Saxon always played there.
Yeah, that's true. Some of the new wave heavy metal bands went through there. You're right.
Right, Lemoore East was I remember actually, like, you know, if you walked into Lemoore East, if you had nothing to do and there was nothing going on anywhere in the city, which was rare, but you went down to Lemoore East. In like 88, 89, the place would be pretty full because that's where all the metalheads eventually just had. There's nothing to do. Go to Lemoore East, whether you were speed metal or poser metal or hair metal. But it mainly by the late 80s, it started catering to a lot more hair metal.
Well, I think that was what was all over MTV and stuff. I mean, even LA. I mean, even though LA was always known for the hair metal, going back from Motley Crue days, but in the late 80s, everyone in their Sunset Strip couldn't even walk through. It was all hair metal, and that kind of
But they would do like the classic metal stuff too. Like, so they would do like, you know, like Yngwie Malmsteen would play.
Yeah, sure.
You know,
you get your national bands coming through.
Yeah, like he would play Brooklyn too, but like he would play in Queens as well. You know, and like it was the same thing. Like early on, you know, Twisted Sister did both. You know. Manowar did both. Motorhead would do both. Like you would never see like Anthrax and Nuclear Assault were not playing Lemoore East, you know?
No, exactly.
Like those bands skip the Queen's date, you know?
Well, I think the promoters actually preferred that too, because they know the hair metal guys wouldn't cause any damage. Usually,
that's right.
The club, there'd just be a lot of eyeliner and makeup all over the place, but
they'd have to make sure they had great mirrors. Yeah,
exactly.
Oh, God.
But Michael, you know, there's this obviously a big resurgence in metal, and particularly in a lot of the hardcore metal. You see, you know, Cro-Mags now doing a tour, of course, Suicidal, and you know, Misfits now bigger than ever, and all these bands, you know, from the East Coast and whatnot. And I apparently Leeway is still out there touring, correct? With other members, and you've got your own band now, Black Ice. Why don't you talk about what's going on currently with that?
Black Ice is actually, honestly, fellas, Black Ice is just a heavy metal tribute cover band.
Oh, okay.
That's what I do.
That's awesome.
I mean, I set them in a bar. I play Judas Priest songs all night, and people go crazy. It's great.
Nice, awesome. Yeah.
But as far as Leeway, I mean, it's pretty much just Eddie, and he has Dan from Monkey Puff helping him on guitar, and Doggy Dog, and Kings Never Die now, and they're just doing local touring. They're just touring local clubs, and they're going cross country and back. It's like, when they play in New York, I still am in contact with Eddie. When they play in New York, he always asks, "Hey, can you want to come up on stage and do a few songs, do this set with us?" And I say yes. I'm not. If it's a Saturday night and I'm doing nothing, I might as well.
Right on.
Yeah,
All right.
awesome.
I'll fire up the guitar and play some Leeway with Eddie. It'll be me, Eddie, and Dan. But as far as the other guys, AJ's busy with Cro-Mags. Jimmy the Poodle, Jimmy Xanthos, he's with Drew Stone and the Hit Squad guys. Everybody's doing their own thing. Pokey, of course, is with AF now.
Mm-hmm.
And Eddie's just trying to do what he has to do to keep the name going. To keep the legacy of Leeway going. I mean, a lot of people are giving him grief about it, but I'm just like, listen, do whatever you got to do.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Really cool.
Well, but that's a good point though, Mike, because like the thing is, one thing about like hardcore in New York in general, like the New York hardcore bands, is there is a group of some of the greatest frontmen, in history.
Yeah, sure.
In these bands, and it all dates back to HR, because, the Bad Brains were in DC and the Bad Brains, moved to New York. And then you had like Roger and Jimmy Gestapo and Blood Clot, all those guys saw HR, and they all got inspired by him, and all three of them being unbelievable frontmen, and something that Leeway had was an unbelievable frontman.
Absolutely.
And Eddie was an incredible, and still is a great frontman, but he was just one of the best. He was like this little, like almost little B-boy kid, who was into hardcore and also knew enough about metal, And so, sometimes when you come from like the hardcore scene, you get kind of condescending to metal people,
Sure.
And like, he didn't do that, And so he was actually like sort of he had this effortless cool thing about him. And, so when he fronted the band and they would open up for metal bands, generally he was able to win people over. And it's funny because like sometimes because he had this B-boy thing about him, like, you'd go to like the Pacific Northwest and he would just confuse everybody, So like that's something that Pete and Lou talk about in the book, where they were like, yeah, we played, we were so psyched to go on tour with them and Bad Brains, with Leeway and Bad Brains. And we were just like, man, they're going to fucking kill, like, cause they hadn't been off the East Coast yet, Leeway. And he goes, this is going to be great. He goes, and we play these, these places in like Portland, Oregon or whatever. He goes, and kids would just stare at them. Like they had no idea what to make of them because of Eddie,
Yeah. I think Eddie, I mean, just me personally, is the best, I wouldn't say necessarily frontman, but pure singer, I think, in New York hardcore in terms of his vocal range and his ability. I mean, just for the fact that, he sings so different than any other New York hardcore singer. I mean, a lot of it, I know he grew up on a lot of like R&B and soul music as a kid, listening to like the Jackson 5 and stuff like that, which shows, and you could see in his range. I mean, because in terms of, like I said, pure singer, I mean, they can hit, notes. I mean, I don't think there's anybody that can touch him, which is why I Leeway was always like, arguably my favorite hardcore band, out of New York, for sure. And a lot of it had to do with, I mean, not just obviously the music was great, but really Eddie's singing was just, second to none, I think, in that scene.
It's funny when I would play Leeway for people who were like mostly into metal and they didn't really know from like hardcore or the crossover, they would hear Eddie and they would always say Ozzy.
Really? Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
You would hear Ozzy a lot. Like when he would go high,
okay,
people would say, oh, he's like kind of a hardcore Ozzy.
That's an interesting comparison. I never thought about that.
And
And I would hear it all the time, and I never thought it in my life.
But once someone said it, then you can't stop thinking about it.
I was
when
like,
you
yeah,
listen to him,
I guess maybe he does. Yeah.
Wow.
I'm sorry. The first time I heard it was when we recorded Desperate Measures, and I heard the final mix. And I heard what the engineers, how they mixed the album and the vocal effects. I was like, my God, this sounds like Ozzy Osbourne singing for Leeway.
Yeah, a lot of reverb, right? Like multiple tracks.
Oh yeah, it was too much. It was way too much.
Yeah.
In the Desperate Measures mix, it was way too much, way too overproduced.
Yeah, it's interesting because he, and I love Tom Soares, but yeah, there's definitely a lot more production. There's a lot more ear candy going on that album than Born to Expire.
Without a doubt. I don't know how Tom let that record get away from his grasp, but it was just, the production is pretty, it's not, the fidelity isn't as thick as it is. I mean, there's a big guitar sound, and that's about it. The rest of the production is real thin.
Well, it's very wet.
Yeah. Oh God.
Well, the reverb was the big thing back then in the late 80s, going into the early 90s. A lot of bands suffered from.
But it was like there was Born to Expire reverb, and then there was fucking
Desperate Measures
reverb. Yeah. They were very different.
Saturated, very wet, as Howard said.
Yeah, but to me, both of those albums still stand the test of time.
Oh, absolutely.
I could listen to both like right now and love them both.
Absolutely, they don't get old at all. Speaking of Tom Soares, and like you mentioned earlier, Howie, about the legendary Normandy sound there in Rhode Island. So what was it that was, because you both obviously have experiences there. Howie, I know you did the Sick of It All, the Blood, Sweat, No Tears album there. What was
and Killing Time, and 24/7 Spies,
that's
and
right.
This and that.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. It became the go-to spot for every hardcore band after. And Born to Expire was that the first album that was recorded there that kind of set that all off because everyone wanted to kind of get that sound. Like, what was so special about that place that made it that go-to spot for?
Well, I'll just tell you from my experience, never having been in a band or anything like that. I mean, it's as simple as this. Everybody heard Born to Expire and wanted AJ's guitar sound.
Got it.
It's very simple.
Simple as that. Okay.
But what I found out, which I thought was really interesting, is that the recording of the Wargasm album predated the Leeway album.
Oh wow! Okay.
It did.
And so my understanding is that Chris Williamson heard that and then said, "I want to bring Leeway," and then the Cro-Mags up there.
Ah, okay.
And then, but we heard it just because we were such like rabid Leeway fans. Like, we made sure we heard Born to Expire like probably a year before it ever came out. And we didn't know Tom Soares. We didn't know Normandy. We didn't know any of this stuff. It was in Rhode Island and we were in New York. And we heard that album. We're like, who's the guy? And then, so what we were told by AJ was there's this guy named Tom Soares, and he's the engineer and he's the one who helped me get this sound. And so it was a cross between AJ's tone and the way Tom Soares mic amps.
Oh yeah, no, that's pretty accurate. It's perfectly said. I mean, the way he recorded when we got that sound, he had AJ's amp. It was both our amps. The way he mic'd AJ's right speaker. He mic'd my bottom left speaker. He had our amps facing each other. And by the biological differences in our body weight and guitars, AJ had an SG, I had a Les Paul, and when he hit record, that's what that guitar sound was. The both of us combining, and then he combined the rhythm tracks, and that's that guitar sound.
I mean, because if you put that on, I love, like, when I DJ shows and stuff like that. If I DJ the Black and Blue Bowl or whatever,
right.
I love playing that album through a giant club PA.
Oh yeah,
I can imagine. Wow,
it just makes me want to kill somebody. I literally want to go out on the dance floor and do that karate bullshit. like I just want to smash people because it's just so fucking awesome.
It is a great sound. Yeah, no, it's
so big and it's so fucking great. And again, New York hardcore came from punk, and it's like super raw, no budget, underproduced, and there was a charm to that, I mean, listen to Victim in Pain, right? It's like, it's out of tune. It's 15 and a half minutes long, the whole album.
The old Don Fury Spring Street
right,
studio, right?
But they like, they surpassed even what that studio was supposed to give you, right? And so that's what people were used to. And then, and obviously as more metal people got involved in hardcore and the crossover, the production value started to matter and people had some gear and wanted to sound better and whatnot. But that was the first album to really come out of New York that had this like, holy shit, listen to that, listen to what they did. And like, they weren't afraid, to do that. And, most hardcore bands, like, you listen to like AF, Cause for Alarm. And to me, it sounds a little bit like watered down Exodus, and, I was into Victim in Pain. So to me, like Cause for Alarm was shocking,
Sure.
So while they certainly did like this crossover thing very intentionally, Leeway, to me, it seems seamless. Like that was them. And this is what they should sound like. And it doesn't matter what metal people think or what hardcore people think or whatever. This is just a record we're making, and it's sincere. And like, now we're going to put it out there to the world. And it just, the power of it and the sincerity of it and just great performances and everything about it was just, I mean, seriously, like I heard it once and I was like, oh my God, like, why are they on Profile?
I mean,
like how do I get this?
We were shooting for a January 88 release date, but then all that red tape came up. Like, Chris wanted to shop in the record to, to get a better distribution deal, and no one was picking up on it. But I mean, if the album would have came out when it should have came out, January or February of 88, I think the story of Leeway might have been a little bit different.
Sure.
Well, think about the albums that came out before your album that were not going to have been out before. So Sick of It All was out. The Bad Brains did Quickness by that time. Underdog had an album. So there were like a handful of bands that had no albums out, for instance. Not Bad Brains, obviously, but other bands that were like cool New York hardcore bands that got their first albums out before you, And that was the shame because, it felt like now you're one of a few things, as opposed to you guys would have just completely stood on your own if that album came out in 88.
And that album was recorded before most of these bands.
It was recorded before and came out after.
Yeah, that's a shame. Let me ask you something, Michael, and Howie as well. Seeing there were so many great metal labels, obviously you had Johnny Z and Megaforce, Roadrunner Records with our good friend Monty Connor. And then, the important records had other, Combat Records. Were the metal labels, were they not into the bands that, because Leeway, as you said, had a very metallic sound. And of course, Monty got really into the whole death metal thing and some other crossover kind of stuff. What did you ever approach like a Megaforce or a Roadrunner, or were these labels just not interested at the time? And not just Leeway, but some of the other hardcore bands. Yeah, please.
I remember January 22nd of 1988, backstage at the Ritz. And I was practicing my guitar. We were supporting Exodus and MOD. And I was practicing my guitar through my little practice amp just to warm up. And I forgot who it was, in all honesty, but a representative from Roadrunner approached me saying, Roadrunner Records is really interested in you guys. And I said, well, now I just turned 19. I'm as dumb as a rock, And I'm like, well, we just recorded a record in Normandy Sound in November of last year, of 87. He goes, oh, so you guys are signed already? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Like I said, no, but if you speak to this guy over here, I'm sure he can fill you in a little more detail. And I pointed him out to Zowie, because Zowie at the time was 27 years of age.
Right.
And he was a little more versed in the business. He was with Death Corps already. He's been around. And so, unfortunately, we were approached, I know, by Roadrunner. They had an interest at the time. But if I could just rewind for a second, how I don't think what I think really killed the Leeway in that whole year that it didn't come out was more of the metal records that came out, like the Testaments, the New Order, Philosopher's No Place to Disgrace. Because all the other hardcore records that, in effect, didn't really start coming out till after ours. Ours was released in January of 89. Killing Time came out after that. Sick of It All came out after that. The Spies, AF came out after that. The only album that was out before Leeway was, And Justice for All.
Right.
I mean, no, Liberty and Justice, I'm sorry.
Right.
AF, and the metal records that were released in '88, like the New Order and Flotsam and Jetsam and stuff like that. The problem was lack of promotion and not knowing what to do. Like in the beginning of this discussion this evening, Profile Records had no idea what to do.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd say there was definitely other interest, Bob. But to my knowledge, only Roadrunner approached us, or Road Racer at the time.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if it was a really just bad situation for Leeway. We signed the wrong contract and we shouldn't have, and then Epic picked up Prong and all these other bands, and it was just
Yeah, it's got to be frustrating, I'm sure, man, because like I said, those records are just so fucking good. I mean, like you said, I still listen to them all the time, like I always say, and you could put that on. I just don't get sick of them, and it's like, and I know so many people who, obviously feel the same way, and it is, unfortunately, that's the I guess the mystique of Leeway was just definitely one of those bands that should have, could have, would have, and should have been, no doubt.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
That's the misfortunes of the record business, man.
Well, that's it, and it's like the band was fine until they signed a deal.
Yeah.
It's like,
well, that's the thing. You never know. You think, Profile, Run DMC, you sign with a hip hop label, and the thing is, a lot of these labels that don't do metal, you think, they could branch us out into other stuff, but a lot of these labels, they don't know anything about metal, and they don't.
Well, I was going to say, the thing is with In Effect at the time, and we formed in '88 and started putting records out in '89, is that you signed a shitty deal too, but the difference is that we fucking killed for our bands. That you didn't just sign the deal and then hope the word of mouth was enough to sell some records.
Mm-hmm.
Like we went hard. We worked our asses off. Like what you were talking about earlier, Bob, about that people on the West Coast didn't really know about some of this stuff. All we fucking wanted was to change that, Like, we wanted people to know. We'd go see a band like Sick of It All and be like, the fucking feeling and energy in this room from this band, this has to go everywhere, Like, we have to get this everywhere. It was very much like when I was younger and the Bay Area bands and stuff, where like you would read, fanzines and listen to college radio, and you would hear about the scene out there and all the young bands and like what was going on. I mean, that shit was going on here too, but it was not happening at the metal equivalent. It was happening at CDs, it wasn't happening at L'Amour. And so, we were like, how do we get this to go everywhere? Like, we didn't want Sick of It All to just be the band that played Boston to DC and back, like we wanted that to be done with and like make them a real deal band. So we were the ones who got them the Exodus tour, and we helped get them that New Titans tour, and then we helped them get a tour with DRI, and they were going across the country in '89 and '90 when most of these bands were only doing the coast, and that's it. And, some of the bands once in a while would maybe fly out to California and do 2-3 shows and come home, but nowhere in between. And it was a tough time because everybody was just, you had to slog it out, and you had to have the willingness to get in a van and go play and know that maybe every other show is going to be shitty,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just the way it was. And it was the same for metal bands. That was touring and that club touring in that time, and a show is going to get canceled while you're in the van, like 2 days from now, and you're not going to get the money from it, like how are we buying gas? Like, we better hawk some extra t-shirts here, the night before. So it was like a really interesting time because, punk bands had certainly toured across the country, but they had it even worse, because they would do the like real van tour, a shitty van, and like really getting paid nothing. And the routing was insane, where you'd play like, San Francisco, then you'd play San Diego, and then go back up and play San Jose.
Go ahead.
Those would be 3 shows in a row,
Mm-hmm.
I remember like that was the difference between a label like Profile Records and In Effect. I mean, even when Sick of It All joined us on the Bad Brain Leeway tour, I mean, you would sometimes see In-Effect posters for Sick of It All, and there'd be nothing for Bad Brains or Leeway.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, nothing. And even on the road, I mean, we had a deal where the Bad Brains Trucking would take Leeway's equipment and Sick of It All's equipment.
Right.
But we were in a van, and Sick of It All were in their own van. But at least Sick of It All, in effect, gave them a car, some sort of tour support.
Mm-hmm.
They had a little red car. I even forgot to make a model, but the road manager always drove it. That guy John.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, at least I was like, hey, look, at least, you see a Sick of It All poster in a cover plane tonight. We have nothing. Profile does nothing.
Well, you know what that kid John did before he left for the tour? He'd call every fucking promoter and send him shit. That's what we did. Like, we made sure that we followed the very traditional, like, metal tour marketing, but with them, and that was our advantage from having Combat in the building, because the one thing they did well was actually, promote touring bands.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't market records all that well, but they actually knew how to tour market. So we had our own guy who would just do like Sick of It All and AF and those bands, and it was great because when Sick of It All would get to Chicago for the first time, at least people knew they were coming, Mm-hmm. So if there were 25 kids in Chicago who wanted to see them open for whoever at the time, they knew it was happening, and that was the most important thing. Is we didn't care about it getting, reviewed in the local paper so much, but like make sure that for a month before the show, if you walked into that venue to see other bands, you knew Sick of It All was playing there on, February 1st, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, look at it. In-Effect bands. I mean, shoot. I mean, you guys had what? You had three at the top of my head: Sick of It All, Prong, and 24/7 Spies. That all got picked up pretty much by a major label. East West had 24/7 Spies and Sick of It All, right? And obviously, Prong went on to Epic. So you guys
don't forget Ludacris turning into Scatterbrain.
That's right, Nick.
Right.
That's right. Yes, that's right. That too. That's right. Correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we were the fucking farm team to these.
Pretty much,
and,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it was one of those things where I was like, well, why don't one of these fucking people hire me? I'm signing all their bands. So but it was the kind of thing where it was still like a very immature scene, where basically. Again, we would do the best we could, but there was so little money involved on our end that all you had to do is have a little bit of money above and beyond that, and you could buy these bands, And so, even with like 24/7 Spies, I guess the contract was sold, with us still having options on them, basically because they paid enough for it,
Mm-hmm.
And the way it worked with Scatterbrain, which was because it was a continuation of the Ludacris contract. I said leeway. I have leeway on the brain. The Ludacris contract, there were new members of the band who were not signed to Relativity. Mm. And so Elektra signed 3 of the guys, and we had 2 of the guys. And they basically said, well, now what are you going to do? And we're like, fuck.
Mm-hmm.
Because nobody knew how to deal with the contracts. Nobody was paying attention to that stuff. And we were fucking hardcore metal kids, like trying to run a label,
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what happened. And then, our Scatterbrain album sold probably 3 to 4 times what their album sold.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting just hearing this and, realizing that a lot of, like you say, Leeway, you started in the mid 80s and all these bands, started before. I remember a lot of the hardcore scene really, and as you say, even on the West Coast, I remember, when I was working at Roadrunner, I was running their LA office in 91. And then, I was dealing with all the radio stations and retail and press people here on the West Coast. And I remember seeing all the charts and everything and seeing In-Effect and seeing all these bands, the hardcore scene. And that's when, Sick of It All. And of course, they did the New Times on the Block with Sepultura that we did. And that was kind of when it was, but I'm thinking if people, because it was like the thrash scene kind of thrived in the 80s, particularly the late 80s, the whole Bay Area thrash scene, after, the big 4, then you had, a Testament and Death Angel and, Forbidden and even Overkill from New York. And that got real big in the 80s. And then, of course, I think if it was just about timing, because, I didn't know that Sick of It All and all these bands were actually from the 80s. And of course, Leeway, I remember from my punk friends. I'm going, is this the same Leeway? But, and then, of course, by the 90s, grunge came in. And that's when the hardcore scene, I don't know. I'm just thinking, timing wise, if the hardcore scene, if it really got the respect it deserved back in the mid 80s. I mean, Cro-Mags, I remember, Cro-Mags obviously on SOD and, Agnostic Front and Bad Brains from the 80s. But it seemed like the scene could have really been built if it was, particularly bands like Leeway, if your album didn't come out, a couple years later or whatnot, I'm looking back in history, but I'm just, do you think that might be the case, Howie?
Yeah, there was a lot of weird timing there. And what's weird is that, when the grunge thing really kicked off, what's funny about that is that's when the major labels were all signing hardcore bands. And what's weird is that the hardcore bands sort of turned into post-hardcore bands. So if you look at that time, the very early 90s, so maybe 90 to 92.
Biohazard and all those bands started.
Well, so that was around that time, but then you also had Quicksand and Orange 9mm and Into Another. So you had all these people who were involved in big hardcore bands, Gorilla Biscuits and Burn and Underdog, all started these post-hardcore bands, but then Sick of It All got signed, to East West and had this huge album, in I think it was 92, so the grunge thing actually didn't get in hardcore's way. It got in metal's way, and if you think about it, look at Nirvana, as soon as they started to get popular and you'd see photos of them, they were always wearing Bad Brain shirts and stuff. You'd always see Dave Grohl wearing a Bad Brain shirt, and people would go, oh, that's where they're coming from, sort of punk, so that was interesting, and it almost gave it a boost a little bit. It gave some credibility to some of that stuff. But it was really, once the major labels get involved in kind of any scene, it's the beginning of the end. Mm-hmm. So, it also caused probably a pretty big period of it falling apart, and disappearing for quite a while because it made it very uncool,
Now, did the major labels try to influence the band's sound? Because, of course, you mentioned Bad Brain. By the time the 90s rolled in, I mean, they changed their sound to more of a reggae thing. I mean, they kind of lost the hardcore appeal. And I think a lot of the bands might have got a little bit too polished.
Sick of It All says absolutely not. They said, and you could listen to the album. I mean, if you listen to, it's their third album, Scratch the Surface. So the first two were on, one was In-Effect, and then they did an EP for an In-Effect, and then the second album was just for sort of Relativity Proper. And then the third album, Scratch the Surface, is the most raw fucking thing they ever did.
It's heaviest,
and and when we talk about it in the book, they're they were just show up and give us your album,
That's good, yeah.
And the first mix they said they hated because Tom Soares was sort of hey, you're on a major label now. This has to be different. They're no, it doesn't have to be different. They're it should be exactly what we are. This is why they signed us, because they think we're about to just take that next step, not with changing our sound, but just that if we do another album and it gets promoted properly, we'll just be more popular. And
that's interesting. Oh, I was just going to say that was on East West, because I'm just thinking that was about the time Cowboys from Hell came out.
That's right. They were label mates.
They saw that. Of course, everyone that knows Pantera, they had 3 albums out previously that were more, I wouldn't say hair metal, but more in that kind of style.
Pretty close.
And, of course, East West really, I guess they kind of foresaw that, this sound was, would do well for this new sound for Pantera. And
and you have Phil was a big hardcore guy. He's a big AF fan. He's a big Sick of It All fan. Sure. He really is like an underground music encyclopedia. Whatever you think of him, I mean, he definitely loves and knows music. Mm-hmm. And, so I forget what one of his side bands, not Down and not maybe with the Illegals.
Superjoint.
I think with the Illegals, he did Agnostic Front covers and things like that. And, he did one in New York. I know that he did United and Strong. So they were label mates, but and Lou worked in the concrete mailroom when Pantera was managed by them, and like all this stuff. So they interacted, but interesting, they never toured together, and I don't think they played any shows together. And he said it sounded as if like Concrete did not want Sick of It All to open for Pantera because they were too much, like it was too aggressive.
Mm. Do you think a lot of these, because I mean, there's so many people that talk about how really New York hardcore, at that time, there was such potential for it to be this new huge thing. Sort of like, I mean, maybe not as big as grunge, but, at least as big as something like thrash, like that kind of genre. I mean, because a lot of it, I mean, if you think about, obviously, with Leeway and with, obviously, Murphy's Law and Cro-Mags, all those bands that were on Profile, I mean, obviously there wasn't a lot of tour support put into it, but there was also like other labels that tried to sign these bands in the early 90s. I remember that record label that came out, Maze Records, that signed Sheer Terror and Biohazard, and the same thing. Yeah. It was almost the same kind of situation where they got kind of long put off, extended delays on their, releases of the records. Yep. Do you think it's just one of those things where people, because, New York hardcore really was one of those genres that embraced a lot of different styles. I mean, like for instance, 24/7 Spy, just thinking of them off the top of my head, obviously they weren't really a hardcore band. They were more like a sort of a funk metal band, like along the lines like a Fishbone or,
they were like a New York's Fishbone.
Exactly.
Chords,
yeah. But the hardcore scene embraced it. And even me grew up in the 90s, they embraced a lot of bands like, even like a Candiria or even like, that Roguish Charmament, that was a hip hop band.
Yeah.
So it's like, I mean, New York hardcore always embraced these sort of bands. So it was, I don't know if it was a lot of like people didn't know what to do with like how to really market New York hardcore.
Well, the thing, there's two things I think with what you just said. I mean, with like, let's say 24/7 Spies, it was the same thing in LA with the Chili Peppers. The Chili Peppers had no place to fit in, and they would play punk shows, like they would play the Olympic Auditorium with like, with punk bands, with Fear and like, and all that kind of stuff. Like that's the only place that they did fit in. And with the Spies, with somewhat, people would go, oh, they're kind of like Bad Brains, and it's like, nah, not really, but like kind of,
Sure.
And so the hardcore kids kind of embraced them because they didn't mind that they were left field and kind of weird. But I do think, and we talk about this a lot in Pete and Lou's book, because they saw a lot of this, was that metal had this like business and this industry built around it, and it was sort of, it wasn't that safe, but it was kind of safe. You had this established like club circuit for those bands to play around the country, around the world. In England, you had weekly magazines for metal. It was a whole different thing. And hardcore never got that kind of respect because it was very fucking messy. It was disorganized for the most part. And you had a lot of volatile kids in these bands. And I don't think a lot of these bands thought about like quote unquote making it. Some of them did, and some people in these bands did. And, so like, I don't think Roger Moret spent that time thinking about like quote unquote making it, where I think Harley Flanagan did,
Sure.
Like Harley Flanagan wanted to be a rock star, he wanted to be big. And, not that you didn't find a lot of that in hardcore, and if you look at like the beginnings of Sick of It All, they said, they're like, all we wanted to do is play CDs, and they're like, we'll just take it from there. We'll see what happens. Like, but when kids start metal bands and they're playing guitar in the bedroom and, Mr. Gibbons, you can account, whether or not this is accurate, like, you're playing because you envision something down the road, and I think it's just, there's a different mentality, generally speaking, and so, the record labels knew of the metal bands because they paid attention to that circuit. And, so I just think, then you had the commercial success of Metallica, right? So you could be in this really aggressive band and, by 1984, they're selling a couple 100,000 records, and they put out their first album the year before, and all we talked about on this phone call was like the difficulty of punk and hardcore bands putting out records.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So
100% correct.
So I mean, like Mike, what were there goals like that for Leeway? Like, were you guys thinking, we want to be a fucking big band, or were you just like, we're just having fun and we're doing what we do?
Now, absolutely. They might not want to admit it, but I'm going to blow everybody up right here. It didn't start out that way. When I first joined the band, AJ was all about, playing just regular places, and when it's all over, I got to get a 9-to-5 job. As the years went on, and we started getting, when we hooked up with Williamson, and we started getting the bigger Rich shows and supporting Megadeth and Testament and Exodus, and I seen him changing as well.
Yeah.
Because, Howie, as you said, and this is full disclosure, I grew up, I loved hardcore because my sister got me into the Ramones back in '79 and punk rock and stuff. And so I heard my first AF song in '83 or whatever, and I loved it, but I never went to see because I was too young and everything. But sure, I was the kid in my basement, Howie, and I wanted to see the bright lights of Def Leppard all over me.
Right.
And I'm just being honest. I'm being honest with anybody that's listening. I wanted to see. I wanted to be the guy playing the Santa Monica Civic Center in the Nassau Coliseum tonight.
Right.
I mean, I wanted to do it playing heavier music. I wasn't all about hair metal at all, but Leeway started out very, with humble beginnings, and I loved the demo in high school. I wanted to be a part of the band, but when we got a taste of opening for Testament and playing in front of these big crowds with 10,000 people and stuff like that, and I saw everybody changing, like, maybe we do have a shot of becoming big because we had a more commercially accessible sound than, say, Sick of It All. Lou, any Sick of It All record, listen to Lou just open up with his fierce fucking vocals. Mm-hmm. You're not going to hear that on Z100.
Right. Sure, yeah.
You might have a chance of hearing Leeway on the Heavy Metal from Hell Hour late at night.
Right.
And I always say that was my personal curse. It was my personal greed to want to live on the hill and be a rock star that damned me to failure in this business.
I think that happened with all the bands, to be honest.
Yeah.
If you look at all the bands, which I guess, whether it be thrash or whatever, or at the time, which were extreme metal bands. I mean, I remember Metallica when they first started out. All they wanted to do was be as big as Motorhead to get the respect of a Motorhead. If they could be America's answer to Motorhead, I mean, their whole motto was being the fastest, loudest, heaviest band in the United States. They wanted to be America's answer to Motorhead. Then Slayer wanted to be the same thing. They wanted to be Venom meets, Merciful Fate. They weren't thinking that none of them thought that they could ever be the next, Journey or Foreigner or whatever bands were at that time. Yet they've become bigger than those bands, or at least Metallica has. They never thought that. But after, I think, once they get the success, or after Ride the Lightning, you got management, you got record labels, and you see the fan base and you see the times changing, then you realize it, hey, maybe we could become this big. And not to mention, you that's what the labels want you to believe. They want you to have the attitude like, we are rock stars. We're going to be rock stars. They don't want you to be small-minded, like all we want to do is play the Whiskey and headline. No, they want you to think, the Forum in Madison Square Garden. So, I could see that regardless of the style of music.
Well, and I also think with Headbangers Ball, it played a huge part in that as well.
Very big thing.
Yeah,
Good.
because I just like you guys, Mike, right? You had Kingpin was on Headbangers Ball, so I guess the next natural thing to think is like, okay, well, we made it in a way. We're on Headbangers Ball, we're on MTV, so naturally the next step is to take that further. So I think that was also a huge part to play with it too.
Big time, because I remember with In-Effect, like, we didn't think for 1 second when we started the label about videos at all. Mm-hmm. There was no sort of discussion. And, so when we had that first day of In-Effect and we had the Agnostic Front live at CBGB album, like, I don't even remember if like MTV asked if we were going to do a video or if we were just had the opportunity to do a cheap video, because we made the Anthem video for $4,000. And, so basically it got made. So we worked with a director named George Seminara, who had worked with like Beastie Boys and Run DMC and all this stuff. And long story short, he was on the Preppy murder trial jury.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so he was on that jury, and it was like 9 months, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're like a director like that and you disappear for 9 months, you kind of almost have to start over, right? Mm-hmm. So he was like a big like Ramones guy, very big, like mid 70s, late 70s CBGB, Talking Heads, Ramones, Blondie kind of guy. And he was a director, and he came to us through the art director at the label and said, "Hey, I'd love to do a music video for Agnostic Front." And we were like, "Okay, we don't have any money." He goes, "All right, I could probably get it done for $4,000." And somehow we were able to do that. And then Headbangers Ball played the shit out of it.
Wow,
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And we were just like, that's crazy. And then we did a Sick of It All video and, all this stuff.
Yeah, that definitely opened the doors for the Headbangers Ball. Definitely opened the doors for the more extreme metal at that time. Absolutely.
Well, they had a producer, a behind the scenes person who was really into that music. And, so she was a fan of like across the board, like sort of aggressive music, metal, hardcore, everything. And so she liked the hardcore bands in New York. So when we had that video, she was kind of surprised, I think. And then we were really surprised when they said they would play it, and, it's like a documentary almost of a CB's matinee, and it was Roger's benefit. And it's one of those shows with like 700 people at CBGB's. And it's just the craziest thing you've ever seen. Like you have no idea who's in the band and who's from the crowd. Like you can't make heads or tails out of what's going on. And it was just really weird.
The benefit day, I'll never forget that show.
Oh my God, that was insane. That was the anniversary. It was January 2nd was the anniversary of that show. And and it was just insane. It was like the greatest show. It may have been the greatest hardcore matinee ever at CB's. I mean, every single band played that show,
Awesome.
Yeah, I remember somebody's head died too. One of the guys from before Killing Time was Killing Time when it was still Raw Deal.
Yeah, they were still Raw Deal. I think
somebody spilled the drink on the Marshall. Had a beautiful JCM 800, man. Fuck, ruined all the tubes.
Oh man.
Oh boy, it was one of those. But yeah, Matt, you're right. Like the Headbangers Ball was a big fucking deal, and because it played all these bands we're talking about got played. I mean, Cro-Mags, Leeway, AF, Sick of It All, everybody, who did a good video and was popular enough got their video played on there. I mean, even if it was just once, people would tape it on their VHS tapes and it would get traded like the demos used to,
Yeah.
And it was, it was just that kind of culture. But, I remember, I loved that song Kingpin. Like when that came out as the first single off of Desperate Measures, like Kingpin came out and I'm like, this is great because it really was ahead of its time as far as like the hip hop groove with hardcore. And, so then the video, and it was like sort of perfect. It was just Eddie doing his thing, and it was real simple, but it was really good. And I saw that and I was just like, Jesus, these guys are going to blow the fuck up. And then I was just waiting and waiting and waiting for it to happen.
Yeah. Well, I remember. And
that album was released a year late too.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Same thing happened all over again. Kurt's trying to shop for a better deal. And that album, Desperate Measures, was recorded in April of 1990. It didn't come out till June of 91.
Right.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So over a year.
I remember the first video of that nature I saw on MTV was when the Cro-Mags was it? Was it We Gotta Know or?
Yep, that was it.
Yeah, that because that was like what 87 or I remember
86 probably.
Like the Peace Cells was Wake Up Dead, and that was between that and Wake Up Dead. That was the first time I saw actual stage diving on stuff on an MTV.
Yeah, me too.
I'm like, wow, and that kind of started it going. And when I saw that, I was like, holy fuck, this is cool. And then, of course,
they made that video. They made the video themselves because Paris Mayhew, the guitar player, who I know you know well, was the guitar player, but he's a filmmaker.
Sure.
And
he went to NYU for a while, Paris.
Right, and now he's like a major Steadicam operator, and he's on tons of movies and TV shows, and but he basically brought the camera with him, which is why, if you notice, he's barely in the video, because he's filming it.
Right.
And so, or he's got someone next to him, like holding the camera or whatever. And so that's how they were able to make that video. And that video is amazing. And it was shot largely, there's some real live footage in there, but then they did that event where, what's that fucking movie? And they were called the Savage Skull. What were they called? God, what was it called? There's this movie that they put the Cro-Mags in as the band,
Yeah.
And they were called like the Skulls. And so they filmed them playing at the Ritz. And, but it was like an afternoon thing. They had people come down and like,
Yeah.
Krishna food and fucking, doing the whole thing. And like, so they played, and like, 500 people showed up to the Ritz. It holds like 1,200, and on an afternoon, and like hung out all day, and they just played and they filmed it, and they used some of that footage for the video too. But those videos were, that was a great time for the videos because, I remember Suicidal obviously were very early in the video
Institutionalized, game. Sure. That was pre.
That was 83.
Yeah, 83.
Right. So it was, so that was done. And then Black Flag had a video early on. There's a couple others that were really, really early, like were almost made with no purpose. But don't forget, Tom Araya's in, Institutionalized.
That's right. He gets pushed.
Yeah, he's
some guy.
Yeah, like so there's that stuff going on, and then that was an interesting, like that. It's like crossover moments you didn't even know were crossover moments because that happened, and most people didn't get to see.
But what I was surprised about with MTV is when they had the Cro-Mags or even like the Wake Up Dead video, that was the first time you saw kind of the live stage diving and that kind of stuff, which I thought, wow, I'm surprised MTV is showing this, because that kind of something that even the clubs in LA kind of banned, and here on a national level on this commercialized music television channel they're showing this, which I thought was was awesome, but I was kind of surprised that they're actually
well, it was a weird time in New York, because at that time, like, the Ritz would never have a barricade, but Lamore always would.
Yeah.
So they would show videos from the same era, because some of the Megadeth Peace Sells video was shot at Lamore, and they didn't show any stage diving because of the barricade, but they showed the pit and stuff. And then the Cro-Mags video is from '86, and it was like at the Ritz, and it's completely no holds barred ridiculousness.
Obviously we could continue this on for another hour or two, but I'm sure, I know it's kind of getting late in New York. If you guys want to start winding down.
I just wanted to ask one more question to the guys. Obviously we talked about earlier, it's been a rough week in the world of, metal music and stuff, specifically in the crossover scene. Reed Mullen from Corrosion of Conformity recently, this week had just passed away. And I believe, I'm sure you guys have had some, experiences, knowing Reed and stuff. Did you want to kind of just talk a little bit about him? He's such an iconic guy. I mean, a great dude from what.
I only met Reed when I was on the Born to Expire tour with Bad Brains. COC joined us on like 10 or 13 shows, in the Southland, on the shows below the Mason-Dixon line. Mm-hmm. And, I found him to be a super guy. I mean, everybody in COC were cool guys. Don't get Pepper Keenan was in the band at the time, and Woody, of course, and Carl. But Reed was like, he was so easygoing and such a great guy. I mean, that's the extent of my personal experience with him, of knowing him. Just through those 10 to 13 shows. I mean, I would see him in New York when he'd be at a show, if he'd be in town. Hey, Reed, how you doing? Stuff like that. But he was a very gracious, solid kind of guy. That was the impression I got from him. He was great, Reed. Really nice guy.
He was a great guy, and like, my experiences with him were much more in the earlier days, not so much the last several years. But I remember I was a COC fan, from around '84, I guess. I had a fanzine around that time, then '85, and so I knew that they were coming up to play CB's. So I wrote to COC, and I didn't know who I was writing to. I just wrote to whatever address they had. There was no person attached to it, but you were basically writing, and sometimes Woody would answer you and sometimes Reed would answer you. So Reed is the one who answered me. And, so when they came up to New York and played CB's, I believe with Leeway at the time, pre-Mike Gibbons.
Yeah.
And it was 85, like maybe the spring of 85. And it was a COC Leeway, I think, Articles of Faith show. And so I got to hang out and interview Reed. And like, I had known him a little bit from afar before that. And he was the heart and soul of that band. And I'm going to go so far as to say, at that time, he may have been the heart and soul of the crossover.
Wow.
Because that guy was the guy who wrote back to everybody, and COC was the crossover band along with DRI.
Mm-hmm.
Those two. That's it. You know, the other bands like all came later. COC and DRI are the reason I could at least say in New York, and I think it's San Francisco and LA as well. Like those are the bands that made the crossover happen from the punk and hardcore side. And he was that guy who just embraced it. It was about music for him. Like it wasn't about the scene. It wasn't about scene politics. It wasn't about the pit. It was about the music and like saying something and playing music that was aggressive, but like meaningful aggressive, you know, not super sloppy, you know, we can't play hardcore. They, you know, those guys could actually play. He was a great drummer. And, you know, so he is a tremendous, tremendous loss. And the fact that he died from, you know, being involved with alcohol stuff and whatever, you know, which is why he was out of the band and you know, blah, blah, blah. It's so tragic and it's so fucked up. And then you have Josh from DRI, you know, who the first time I saw DRI, the first few times I saw DRI, he was in the band, and then he was out of the band and then back in the band and whatever. But, you know, another guy in a band that just carried the flag for that whole thing, like that whole crossover thing. And like, where the fuck would we be without those bands, you know, and those guys? But like, Reed was, every fanzine interview with COC was with Reed, you know, like, so when you'd read about COC, you were reading Reed's words, you know, it was him explaining his band and what it was like to do that in the South, which was a whole other thing.
Right.
True. Yeah.
When I spoke to Reed about that, I was like, how does a band from Skinner country turn into what you guys are? And he was like, man, it just happens, man. There's a lot of aggression down here. We just don't, you know, give me 3 steps just doesn't do it for me.
But the thing is that
it was he didn't mean that to be insulting, of course. It was funny, but on a musical note, that Howie was saying, when we were when COC joined the tour for like, you know, those 10 to 13 shows, AJ and I would get spots right on the side of the stage on Reed's left-hand side, or actually on his right-hand side on stage left. And AJ always said this: Reed Mullen's going to blow everyone away tonight. And I mean drums, guitar, everybody.
it's true.
Out of all 3 bands. And when Reed started playing, it was just like, oh my God, man.
That's awesome.
Yeah, he was powerful, you know, and it's a tremendous, tremendous loss. And it makes you remember, like, you gotta be grateful while you're here.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, cool. I guess we could close it out. I mean, hey, Mike, so, other than playing with Black Ice, and you guys, you just do, like you mentioned, you just do some, you know, local shows and stuff. You have fun with it and stuff. Are you releasing any kind of new music, or have you, you know, released anything really since Leeway and stuff that anyone could check out? Or if anyone wants to get in touch with you, there's any way, you know, they can get in touch with you via social media or anything?
Sure. I mean, I have my own Facebook page under my own name. You know, it's not Mike Gibbons official or anything.
Sure, of course.
Like that.
Official.
Just contact me, Mike Gibbons. Michael. It's my full name, Michael Gibbons. Because back then, I've been on Facebook for like 12 years. Back then, I don't know if anybody recalls on Facebook when you did a profile, they wouldn't let you use like a name like Mike or Rich. You had to write your full name out. Like it would have to be Howard Abrams.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I never bothered to change it. So my name on Facebook is Michael Gibbons.
Okay.
That's how Matt found me, you know, the picture of the guy with the guitar, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I did a band called SP111 after Leeway, and it was more in the Megadeth progressive metal vein. And the reason why the name is so weird is because it was a dream the drummer had at the time. He actually met, God rest his soul, speaking of passed on musicians, he met Neil Peart from Rush in a dream.
Wow.
And Neil Peart wrote SP111 on a piece of paper and gave it to him when he asked him for his autograph. And I said, let's just name the band, and maybe it's a sign that some success might come our way or something. I don't know.
Nice.
And then after that, I released a solo CD, just Mike Gibbons, you know. And it got a lot of record label interest for back when I released it in 2003. You know, it's more like figure a harder-edged classic rock Boston meets Rush sort of thing.
Okay.
Nice.
Cool.
And I don't know why hardcore wasn't coming out of me, metal wasn't coming out of me. That's what came out of me at the time. That's what I was creating. And it garnered a lot of record label interest, but of course, you know, nobody made a move at the time, and, you know, here I still am. But you could download everything from the page and stuff like that if you go to my Facebook page, Michael Gibbons.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks. And Howie, I know, obviously you've got the Sick of It All book coming out, I believe, this summer. And I do remember hearing something, you were looking into starting up a radio station. Is that still in the works, or is that kind of shelved?
It's still being discussed. What happened was, I was doing it with, I'll keep it brief, but I was doing it with a partner, and it was going to be housed in the basement of a club actually downtown, and the guy had to close the club, and so we lost the location. But thankfully, he also has several other venues that we can do it at, but he's on tour now for a little while, so it's all just kind of backburnered. But I still think that's going to happen, and
cool. That'd be great, man.
Yeah, because we used to love doing our radio show, and I would love to do something in New York and give people a voice to bring some different kinds of music that's very New York centric back to people, and I think that would be fun. And then we have the Pete and Lou Kohler book coming out June 9th, and the Metallica ABC's book came out in November, and looking to see who I'm going to write about next, and if it's going to be a children's book or for actual adults.
Well, I mean, you can write about Michael Gibbons too, right?
I was just going to say, Howie. Actually, I'm going to put it on blast right now. Howie's starting developments on writing a book. It's the XYZs of Mike Gibbons, the most legendary New York hardcore figure ever.
Yeah.
All right.
R is for ridiculous.
And Michael did tell me he wanted me to throw us out there that he said the Bad Brains still suck. Is that right, Mike?
Oh, we should have went off on that in the show, because Howie would pull out his Cavalier sword and kill us.
I'll tell people who don't know Mike all that well, one of the best things you could do is when Mike decides to jump in on a thread on Facebook, and it's impossible if you don't know him to know if he's kidding or not. So he'll jump in and talk about how terrible certain things are and how he invented stuff. And you would have no fucking idea if he's kidding or not. And it's amazing because you could see the pregnant pauses in people, even in Facebook posts. They don't know what to do with themselves. They're like, did he mean that?
I think that's hilarious, but that could get you in trouble these days.
Well, that's the thing. The first time I ever saw him do it, I'm like, wait, is he on drugs? What's going on? And so then, you realize that it's no, he's just fucking with everybody. And, so it's so funny because I wait for him to chime in now because I want to see what he does. It's going to be some crazy shit that he's going to do.
Nice.
I can't help it. Somebody will post something about and National Puppets to me was such a game-changing record, and I'll just have to be like, "What are you talking about? That band sucked."
Yeah, but then you'll say you wrote half the album.
If it wasn't for me, Kirk Hammett wouldn't exist. I gave him Battery and freaking Sanitarium. What are you talking about?
He totally writes shit like that.
That's great.
And sometimes you get the guy that doesn't even know me at all. It's like, yo, man, what the fuck, dude? Some metal dude from... I'll just keep riding. Yeah, you don't know shit. I wrote fucking half of Taking Over for Overkill. I wrote all of the New Order for Testament.
It's it's like with Larry David, where you're just like, I didn't recognize the tone.
I love that show.
It's
great.
Awesome.
Well,
awesome.
Gentlemen, thank you for having us.
Yeah, well, thank you guys. Yeah.
Pleasure.
Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
Thank you as well. Thank you, everybody.
Hey, great meeting you, Michael. And Howie, we'll keep in touch. And Matt, we'll talk real soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Great talking to you guys.
Great meeting you, Bob. Thanks, Matt and Bob.
Yeah.
Right, bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.